I didn't know what I didn't know what I just saw.
Good morning, everyone. We are going to go ahead and get started. Again, welcome. It's great to see you all this morning. I'm Eve Carney. I'm the Chief of Districts and Schools at the department. My colleague here, Sam Piercy, is our Deputy Commissioner, and Trudy Hughes is Chief of Staff in the Office of Districts and Schools. We welcome you this morning. It's wonderful to be back in Pulaski. If you've not recorded this yet, I'll come back to it. But want to go ahead in the interest of time and making sure we maximize the time we have together today to move ahead. I do have to share a statement just to let you know kind of where we are in a larger process. So I am going to do what I never like to do, which is read to you, but was instructed that's what I am to do. The Tennessee Department of Education is excited to work with you on this opportunity to discuss the state's formula for funding public education. Before we begin, the department would like to remind you of the following. Conversations on this topic are not intended to reflect on the current BEP funding formula. The current BEP funding formula will remain in place until a new funding formula is recommended to and approved by the Tennessee General Assembly. The public is encouraged to submit comments in writing to ensure that all communications are thoroughly documented and can be reviewed and considered in the future. Public comment is encouraged to focus on developing a new formula rather than revising the current funding formula. Consider what should be funded in a new funding formula and at what level. Subcommittees will be responsible for reviewing public comment and making recommendations for what should be included in a new funding formula. While all committees, subcommittees, and members of the public should feel free to communicate openly, documents and records may be subject to public inspection pursuant to the Tennessee Public Records Act and may be publicly posted or otherwise made available. All recommendations that are submitted by committees and subcommittees will be reviewed and considered, but not all recommendations will ultimately be included in the proposed new funding formula. So just be aware that feedback that we get today, feedback that you submit to the TNEDU website, that gets filtered up to the subcommittees, the 18 subcommittees that are currently tackling the funding formula. As the first slide said, today's conversation will focus more specifically on the local contribution and the state and local split of the state and local contribution. So I will say welcome to you, and we will get going. This is number 7 this week of these conversations. We started on Tuesday in Jackson, then in Martin, Wednesday, Cookeville and Cleveland, Thursday, Johnson City and Knoxville, and saving the best for last, we have Pulaski and Dixon this afternoon. So welcome. It has been a fantastic week of conversations, but clearly a busy week as well. We welcome you and appreciate, you know, how busy, like not even counting like Christmas and the holiday, but everything else we have going on. Such a busy time. Truly appreciate you spending this morning with us to engage. We're going to spend some time talking about a couple of things. Sam is going to provide some information kind of at a summary level of what's kind of happening in that school funding conversation to date. The public comment is still open. It's still available for you to submit comments. And so this is just kind of what we've heard so far. He's then going to focus a little more specifically on the local funding contribution and provide an overview of some high-level things just to kind of ground the rest of the session. The majority of our time will be spent having you all work on some discussion and sharing out back to us some feedback that we need regarding our next steps in this process. And so we will spend the bulk of the time doing that and in discussion. If there's time at the end, we will have some Q&A, but certainly we'll try to hang around a little bit. I was just told it's an hour and a half to Dixon, got 2 hours to get there. I want to make sure I don't keep anyone waiting there. But this is the way we will spend our 2 hours this morning. And we want to go ahead and get started, but I just can't say thank you enough. I do think it's important to know who's in the room and what team members you have brought. This has been probably one of the most fascinating things, is to have groups from different districts and communities together having a conversation. Oftentimes those conversations happen amongst just superintendents or just commissioners or just school boards. And so to have everyone bring that point of view to this conversation has been incredible. And so I look forward to hearing from you today. And we will start with our friends from Trousdale.
Good morning, I'm Clint Seinfeld, the Director of Schools in Trousdale County, and I have our school board chairman, Mr. John Kerr, with us this morning.
Wonderful. We'll just go up the row here.
If you dare, Director of Schools, Johnson County, we have our Finance Director, Beth Moore Sumners, our County Mayor, Melissa Green, and one of our County Commissioners, Mike Cesarini, and our Board Chair,
Wonderful. Thank you. We'll just go right behind it.
Bedford County, I'm Tammy Garrett, Superintendent. John Boutwell, School Board. Robert Daniel, Finance Director. The County Mayor, Chad Graham, and County Commissioner, Linda Young.
Wonderful. Thank you all for being here.
Marlon Davis, Director of Schools in Wayne County, and I have with me Mary Lauren Garner, represents County Commission, and Debbie Brown is School Board Member.
Wonderful. Thank you all for being here. How about that?
All right, Katrina Stevens, Director of Schools, Tullahoma City Schools, Finance Director Jason Ray, School Board Vice Chair Teresa Lawson, City Mayor, Mayor Ray Noes, City Administrator Jennifer Moody.
Wonderful. Thank you all for being here. We'll come across the back here.
I'm Alan Stanton. I work for UT Southern, and I'm just here to host.
Thank you for hosting. It's a wonderful space.
Eric Lomax, Director of Schools, Perry County. I guess I'm a party of one today.
Hey, parties of one are well received and accepted. We've had parties of one at every one of our sessions. Thank you for being here. What about the right there? Oh, okay. Jacob.
Jacob Sarles, the Director of Marshall County Schools. Got Chris Lowe here with me, Finance Director. Julie Kenny Cathy, she's our Board Chairman. Tony Byer, County Commissioner, and Mike Kenny, the Marshall County Mayor.
Wonderful.
And I'm Doug Buchanan. I'm with Murray County. I'm the Murray County Finance Director.
Wonderful. So thank you all for being here. I think it's important to know just the different perspectives that you will hear from today, but also who else is in the room in terms of proximity to your district. So as we have these conversations and you hear things, it's just helpful to know who else is in here giving some information. I wanted you all to introduce yourself because I do think this gathering of this specific group is uniquely equipped to give us feedback on the very important discussion of what does a local contribution look like in a new formula, and what is that state-local split that we all know in our current formula. And so I think hearing from the funding side and the leadership side, and I think is really what will allow us to make informed decisions. And as we go through the morning, I certainly think that you will have lots of opportunity to share thoughts that you may have, feedback, but really important to inform this incredibly important component of the work. And so we're gonna, well, I always forget this, sorry. So when I think about the work of the department and our focus on ensuring that every child has an excellent education and highly effective teachers and supports needed to be college and career ready, none of that happens without the work that you do, without the work that Sam and I get to do with the department. Yes, it may be in the background, but certainly it makes everything else happen. None of those priorities exist without the funding, without the support and the budgeting that you all do on the local levels to make that happen. So it is what undergirds all of our strategic priorities and work at the department. And so with that, I want to hand off to my colleague for him to provide some information to ground our conversation today. Again, welcome. We're so glad you're here.
Good morning, everyone. As you've said, my name is Sam Kiersey. I serve as the Deputy Commissioner of Operations at the department. I want to start by reiterating what you said and just our sincere thanks for you being here. It is a unique opportunity to have this group of people together. I'm going to take a minute and just brag on both sides of the groups that are here today. For local officials, I want you to know that the superintendents in this room represent some of the strongest advocates for your community, and that is a really cool thing to see. You should be very proud of what they're doing for students in your communities. For superintendents, you all know this, but these local officials have a sincere and deep commitment to your communities as well. We have seen that play out, specifically in the funding conversation, but in many other ways as well. So I just want to say thank you for all you've done to date for kids, and I am glad that you're here to delve into this. I would also be remiss if I did not say that Marianne Dursky sends her best. She has not been out on the road with us due to some health issues, but certainly been on the phone with me as we road warrior across the state. If you'll give me just a little moment here to frame up what I want to talk about. I think that one of the things that we have talked about in this funding conversation has all been centered around the funding formula piece. For the metaphor that lives on in infamy around school finance, it's about building the pie, right? We've talked a lot about all the pieces that go in, what that looks like, what dollar figures are attached to it. The second part of school finance in this conversation is how does that shared responsibility play out between the state and between local communities? Education has always been a shared responsibility between the state and locals, especially here in Tennessee. It is under the BEP. We'll talk about that in a minute. But that's the part of the conversation we want to focus on today. To do that, however, I realize people need a little foundational understanding of what's been going on in the funding formula conversation. So I'm going to take a few minutes and highlight where we stand to date on the feedback we've heard in public comment, on the feedback we've heard from the subcommittees. It's just a snapshot in time. And while I want to make sure that we collect any feedback you may have on that piece of it, the reason this group is convened is really about what can the state and local contribution discussion look like. So I just want to root that I'm going to do that thing that you're not supposed to do in presentations and do a hard pivot right in the middle, going from funding overview over here to how do we think about the shared fiscal responsibility over here. So let's jump in on this piece. What are we talking about in the funding formula conversation at the state level? Right, we're talking about a shift from a resource-based model, which is what our basic education program, or the BEP, is now, to a student-based model. We've gotten lots of questions about what is that? What is the difference in the framing? How does it pan out differently? So I want to give a couple of quick examples of what that may look like. Under our current formula, you have 20 kindergarten students. Those 20 kids generate one teacher, and then the formula funds that one teacher. So the resource that we're funding in that model is the teacher unit, right? You think about special education under our current model. You get one special ed teacher for 8.5 students who have an option 10 on their IEPs, right? So for kids who have very severe needs, they generate one teacher for 8.5 of them, and the formula funds that teacher, right? Rather than in a potential student-based model saying, hey, option one means speech therapy. What does it look like to fund speech therapy? What could we do to fund speech therapy? So we're bridging the gap and pulling the student need closer to what the funding is. Okay. Another good example, technology, right? I don't know a tech director in the state who hasn't been pounding down the door for how do we refresh our devices after a few years, right? That is a constant challenge that we have, especially with as much virtual stuff as came into play throughout the pandemic. Right now, the basic education program funds a $40 million pot for the resource that is technology. What would it look like to think about that from a student lens and say, what does it mean and what does it cost to keep a student's technology needs met over time, right? How do we think about devices? How do we think about connectivity in a way that isn't just a one-time investment or this very broad resource-based model, but targets it down to what does a student need to achieve? So that's what we're talking about. These numbers have been shared before, but if you throw in District of Columbia, You throw in these hybrid, you got 39 states out there who are doing something in the student-based model approach. Right? So it's not a new lens on things in terms of the national landscape. Here's what that looks like. And again, I know some of these words are very small, so please know that we will send this deck out afterwards. In a student-based model, you have a base allocation that goes to every student in the state, regardless of where they live, what unique needs they may have. That base should encompass all of the core things that are necessary to provide an education in the state. All right, and we'll go through a few examples of the things we've heard from public comment to date, as well as from the subcommittees in a moment. Then you have the weights. These are those things that may warrant additional consideration for funding. Do I have economically disadvantaged students or special education breakouts? How might those look in a weight, right? What can we apply to the base, a 1.1 multiplier, 1.2 multiplier, to say it does look different to educate this student. They have different needs, and how do we think about that part? Direct funding are dollars for specific and targeted programs. So think about your AP class offerings, your dual credits, your ACT retake. It's an exact dollar to an exact student program need. And then outcomes. What might it look like to incentivize strong outcomes by saying, if you achieve this, you get more money in your district to help support that, really celebrating the wins in the district. What I want to highlight, and this goes off the screen just a little bit, are the 4 big requests that we've heard resonating throughout the conversations around this. And again, we're at a snapshot in time. The conversations are far from over, but wanted to highlight these pieces. Request number 1, districts should not receive less state funding than they receive under the current BEP formula. We need more money for students. It's not a new request, new claim, and it is obviously the top line that we hear across the state. Second, maintain flexibility for local district budgeting. I heard this team talking about this earlier. If you've been around the BEP for a while, you've heard it said the BEP is a funding formula, not a spending plan. Right? That request has remained true in these conversations. Locals want to maintain the flexibility to decide how to use the dollars to best meet their kids' needs in their own community. Third, ensure that whatever is currently funded outside of the BEP is included in the new formula. So I'm going to take a minute and parse a few things on this one. This is about state-funded grants. There are lots of federal grants out there as well, but state-funded grants that currently go to almost all districts in the state. So we're not talking about competitive grants, but things like coordinated school health, school safety. These are grant programs that go to almost every district. How do we think about moving those from outside of the BEP, where they live now, into what would be a new funding formula? I want to be really clear about what that means, what it looks like, right? Those grants create, and I'll look at the finance directors nodding and smiling on this one, they create additional budgets that have to be filed in the state grant management system, additional plans that have to be filed, reimbursement requests that must be filed. It's a lot of administrative work to keep up with these additional grants. So we're talking about removing that barrier and saying those funds now go into the formula. Important notes on this. That means that while the administrative task of the grant management goes away, and because it's in the actual funding formula, you now have flexibility on how you spend those dollars, a few things still remain true, right? The requirements in law around those grants don't magically disappear. You still have to create emergency operation plans for your schools. You still have to have drill logs and all of those components. But instead of saying, here's the dollar you must spend to do that, the dollars are now in the flexible funding pot that says you decide how you meet those requirements, right? One of the other concerns that has been raised, so I just want to address it head on here, is that this is not about a bait and switch with those. We're not going to take that money and put it in the pot and say, hey, we increased funding and walk away, right? We'll be extremely transparent about whatever grants outside of the funding formula move into it so that everyone can see that dollar to dollar transfer. The last statement is going to prompt a lot of our conversations today too. That is that the local match component should be stable, what it would look like under the BEP, for 3 to 5 years. So as a little bit of a number cruncher myself and spending a lot of time with the BEP, here's what I know to be true. You can't make a decision about what local versus state contribution would look like until you know a dollar figure. You can't commit your communities to that without having real numbers in front of you and the real formula that may be proposed, may be accepted. You have to see that in order to have this conversation about local contribution in a meaningful way. We recognize that. We don't have numbers. There's no formula sitting on my computer right now about what this will be. It's truly being built with the input that is coming in. So we don't have those numbers today. And we're not going to ask you to make a decision about what local contribution should look like. Instead, today's conversation is going to focus on what would it look like to have that conversation? What information do you need to be armed with to try to tackle and feel informed and go into that conversation feeling empowered with information you need to help decide what it may look like. We know number one is going to be the numbers. You got to know how it's playing out. I want to step back and give you just a little bit more context on some of the items that have been discussed in public comment and in the feedback from the subcommittees today about what may go into a base, what may go into weights, and so forth. For those of you who have followed education finance in Tennessee, these items are going to look familiar to you. They've been the request on the BEP review committee for a number of years for a reason. Nurses, either at every school or at the nationally recommended ratio. Counselors, school psychologists, teacher salaries, and benefits continue to be popular items to bring up. One principal of every school, also very popular, and close to my heart just as an operations person, flexibility for facility funding and or deferred maintenance. You all know this, we have a lot of aging school buildings across this state. And that is a real need that we have to ensure that is properly funded to take care of kids coming into those buildings every day. On the weights, we have some usual suspects up here, and then we have some new things that we didn't necessarily expect to hear about, but have been pleased with the feedback on. Economically disadvantaged, that is part of almost every funding formula in the country, right? What do we do for students who are receiving benefits from TANF and SNAP, right? But we also heard about concentration of poverty. So what does that multiplier effect look like when you have a lot of students living in poverty who are in a single school? So think about the difference between Title I schools and non. Students with disabilities, English learners, we've obviously heard a lot about those. Rural and sparsity, we knew rural would be a popular item. Sparsity was something that bubbled up, right? For communities that may be rural but small towns and all of the schools are clustered together versus a community that is very stretched out, right? And the school buildings are 60 miles apart. Transportation costs look very different for those two communities. How do we think about sparsity in that piece? And then we continue to hear a lot about fast growing and charter enrollment. Flags of things we expected to hear, but have not heard as much about. Gifted students, dyslexia, small LEA size, so really thinking about how do smaller LEAs balance out the need for economies of scale, and K2 small class size weight. I can't tell you how many people have voiced this week the concerns about what's going on with our earliest grades and the impact of having been out of school or not had some of those pre-K experiences that help with developmental pieces. It's a very different lens on when those kids are coming into school. The needs look different than they ever have before. I just want to say again, these conversations are not over. So when we say that we haven't heard as much about this to date, the public comment is not closed. It is ongoing. The subcommittees continue to meet, so the opportunities continue to exist to fill that feedback. When we think about some of those potential direct funding pieces, these are some of the items we've heard a lot of positive feedback around. Financial literacy. Middle school CTE, for those of you who work with the federal Perkins grant, you'll know it recently was extended down to the middle school grades. What might it look like to have additional investment in that from the funding formula? Innovative High School Models was a grant program that the state ran using relief funds, became immensely popular. What might it look like to continue and sustain that programming in a funding formula? Extended school year, the conversation around this really seemed to focus on the summer programming that has occurred and how do we keep that going and keep it targeted to local needs. RTI, also a big thing. For those of you who work with the BEP, you'll know that it currently funds at a system-wide approach, but RTI is being enacted in every school building. What might it look like to think about it as a program that's taking place in each school? And high dosage tutoring. Outcomes, again, a few of the things that we've heard the most of and positive feedback on so far. Early post-secondary opportunities, AP course completion, industry certs, work-based learning. What you'll notice is that the trends here tend to focus on that post-secondary readiness or workforce readiness. They're the high school metrics, right? We've also heard a lot about the subgroup gap closure, right? What are we doing in those early grades, those more traditional notions of outcome pieces? So I'm going to pause here because this is where I'm going to do that big pivot. And I'm going to reiterate again, what I just went over is what the funding formula conversation looks like, the building of the pie, right? Now we're going to kind of pivot our attention and talk more about once that pie is built, what does that shared fiscal responsibility look like, right? And while these conversations really do come at separate points, this is unique to this group. Everyone in this room touches that local contribution dollar in some way, shape, or form. And that's why we're here today, and I want to try to focus our attention on it. I'm going to talk a little bit about what happens under the current BEP first, so people have a little bit of a grounding in what this looks like. I want to reiterate again, this has always been a shared cost, right? It is a shared cost under the BEP. That will continue. One of the things that I have also heard is that there's a popular line out there that the BEP is not fully funded. I just want to take a minute and talk about that line for a second, because I don't want the misconception to misalign the feedback that you are providing. When people say the BEP is not fully funded, right? And they mention that to a legislator and he calls me into his office and says, are we not fully funding the BEP? I have to say, no, sir, we fully fund the BEP. That's legally required. We would be violating the law if we did not fully fund the BEP, right? What's really at issue is that people are likely providing feedback on saying the BEP does not capture all of the costs we experience to run schools in our communities, that issue, or we don't necessarily agree with the cost sharing model between locals and the state. Those are the real issues people want to get at, right? So when you hear the line, the BEP is not fully funded, be sure to push on which of those two things are really at issue. And what we'll talk about today is that local versus state split. So I just want to start there. For those of you who know the BEP, again, it is our basic education program. It is called the Basic Education Program. It provides a basic level of funding for education across the state. It includes 47 different components spread across 4 different categories. Now, 47 different components covers a lot of ground. We know it doesn't cover everything. We know that we're not aiming to just simplify for the sake of simplification. But what I can tell you is someone who has tried to explain funding to my wife, as we have a daughter in public schools, is that it is hard to explain the BEP formula succinctly in a way that someone can understand, here's what's going on there. Here's how money is generated by your kid. As we shift gears here, this is how the current setup works to determine state versus local contribution. In the BEP, across those 4 big buckets that each contain a number of those 47 different pieces, there's a starting point split, and that ranges across the 4 different categories. The first big category is instructional salaries. That split starts at 70-30. 70% of that is state funded, 30% of that is local funded. That's the starting point for everyone in the state, right? We build the pie, and then we start to split it up in terms of who's going to put in what money for it. That split, again, varies by component. It ranges all the way down to 50% state, 50% local for our non-classroom components. What then happens is that 70-30 split for your county is further adjusted for this fiscal capacity piece. And we'll talk about that in a moment. But that fiscal capacity piece is attempting to capture, does a county have an ability to pay, and I'm choosing my words very carefully there, on ability to pay more or less of a relative share across the state. So the way that translates is that for a county who may have a higher ability to pay, the 70-30 split swings a little bit. So maybe the state puts in 65% for that county, and the county puts in 35%. For counties who have less ability to pay, it's the inverse. Maybe the state puts in 75% and the county puts in 25%. So that fiscal capacity is attempting to adjust for local context on ability to pay. And that's where we get these numbers. This is about as you know, a point for people who live and breathe this every day. But you know this, the local funds come from primarily property taxes, and then each of your counties may have a collection of other revenue streams or not that go into public education funding. So going back to this notion of fiscal capacity, right? Because when we start to talk about a state and local share, we know that it's two things. It's what is that starting point split, and then how does this fiscal capacity thing impact my county or district? Again, lots of financial models underneath, but at a top line level, it's trying to capture the ability of a county to raise local taxes for education. The second bullet up here is important. It really is not, it is based on ability, not whether or not the revenues are actually raised. Okay? And that's an important distinction. So if you have a property tax assessment that comes in and says, yeah, guess what? All of our property tax values have gone up this year. That's what goes into a fiscal capacity lens, not whether or not the county came back and actually raised property taxes and generated the corresponding revenues. So I want to be sure that that differentiation is highlighted right now because it's an important one. The formula determines each county's ability based on average rates across the state, so it's a relative measure. And it's determined at the county level, not the district level. So we have many multi-system counties that may have a city school district, a special school district embedded in it. It's important to note that fiscal capacity is only measured at the county level right now. And under the BEP, we have two different calculations that happen for fiscal capacity. One by TASER, which is a state entity, and one by UT-CBER, which is at UT Knoxville. Those two provide two expert lenses on what fiscal capacity means. They calculate them both differently, and they have different inputs and different variables on it all, and those are merged together, 50% weights on each, to get what is the fiscal capacity for locals to be able to pay. This all generates two numbers that your county commission and local officials who deal with the county budget and your finance directors internal to the school systems know very well. The first is the local required match. This is the output of all that math we just talked about, right? After we do the 70-30 split or whatever the first one is, after we adjust for local capacity, we get a number that says this is the state dollars that are going to be put into your system. We get the local number that says this is what the county must put in for your system. That's the local required match. Okay? Output from all that conversation. In a totally different part of state law, we have the maintenance of effort requirement, but it has real implications for your county. And what it says at a basic level is you must put in, as a county, the same amount of money into your education system this year as you did last year. So we know that many counties across the state are putting in more education dollars than what the local required match is, right? We know that is happening across the state. That can be adjusted for declining enrollment, but that's what generates the maintenance of effort requirement. Again, it is outside of the funding formula in state law and is held over here.
Do you know of any counties in which that equals?
Yes.
Really?
Yes. So there are some counties that are much closer together, right? And that can be for any number of valid reasons. Distressed counties, things like that, where those numbers may be a lot closer together. So yes, that absolutely happens, right? But these are the two numbers that must be considered each budget cycle when it comes up, when you're looking at what do I have to put in for my education system. These are the two pieces that have to be captured. Where does this all leave us? So I'm going to kind of pull back together the funding formula conversation and this local contribution piece, right? Again, I said this at the beginning, but what I know as a numbers guy is you can't have a real conversation about what the split should be until you see the new formula, until you see the new dollar figure that we're talking about here, right? That's just real, right? We can talk about it at a theoretical level. We can have all the debates about fairness and all of that. But until you're able to see the numbers, you're not able to say my community can or cannot meet that expectation. So this is where we are based on the feedback today. We're proposing a starting point, and this is what we're here to gather feedback and input on, that we break this apart. Maybe I'll come over here for the funding formula. There's the funding formula. There is a sense of urgency to get more dollars into schools for kids now. There's political appetite to do it at the state level. There's a financial opportunity to do it at the state level, right? So there's a window here that says, let's tackle the funding formula piece now. Separate from that, we have the local contribution and the state contribution, which again, can't be really decided if we don't have all these numbers fully baked and know and have them in our hands. So what we're proposing is to handle this funding formula now, and then propose to the General Assembly potentially that we take a year from the time we know what the formula is to have real conversations and come up with what, if any, changes we would want to have on the state versus local share piece. Right? And I'll be honest with you, we have heard great feedback across the state on this. We talked about grants outside of the funding formula moving into it. Some of those grants require a local match right now. Others do not, right? If they do not require it and we move it in, how do we account for that? How do we adjust for it? There's real conversation that needs to happen once we know the numbers. So what would it look like if we took 1 year and said we're going to convene the right stakeholders in a room, represented this group, and really dig into it once we have final numbers in hand and can see what the impact would look like. And then take potentially up to 4 more years to actually implement any changes at the local level. So it's not we made the decision and we've got to do something tomorrow on it. That's kind of where we're starting based on the feedback we've heard. And so to translate that and really what would this mean? It means that districts could see more state funding in the new formula, but local communities would not have to contribute anything additional for at least 5 years. And what we would, again, starting point recommendation, suggest is break that 5 years into 1 year to come up with a new decision of what state and local contributions could look like, right? Maybe that we keep what we've got, maybe that we revisit how fiscal capacity is calculated, maybe that we revisit starting point splits, could be any of those, right? No projections on what it could be. And then give communities time to ramp into whatever that could look like, another 4 years or so. So that's where we're starting. And before I turn it back over to Eve for discussions, what I want to acknowledge here is that there's a lot to this, right? And there's a big opportunity to get more money into schools, and that's huge. And there's going to be an impact, whether it's just changing budgeting practices, right? Or having to come up with other local strategies. And that warrants taking time to see what that needs to look like. But we're saying right now, if we just focus on the formula and work through that, then we will have real numbers that we can start to have more meaty conversations about what does that look like for your local community? And what does that mean in terms of what it needs to look like moving forward? So before I turn it back over to Eve, I will open it for any questions on this piece. I will just say here at the beginning, if your question or comment may fit better in some of the discussions that are forthcoming, I may ask you to hold it and turn it into that piece. But anything I can answer for people on what we currently have in place for local contribution or how that works? Rainy day, just everyone, fine. We'll take it. All right, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you, Sam. And so a lot of information, a lot of foundational information, and a lot of things that are actually going to kind of guide our next and the majority of the time that we have here today. And that is really about having that discussion that if we take this year, we take 12 months from the date we have a number to do this, to dig deeply, because to be able to look at all of the components, the things that are working, the things that aren't working. Do we stay with the Tasser-Sieber 50-50 split, or do we go a different direction? All of that requires a larger conversation, and it also requires us to have more information on the front end so that we can build out models, so that we can look at the impact if the split stays the same, if the split adjusts for the instructional or the non-instructional or classroom, non-classroom. So all of those things have to be considered, and it truly does involve your participation today, but also going forward. So again, this is the first of future discussions we will have. And so just a little bit on timeline before I jump in. Right now, the 18 subcommittees are meeting very frequently, building the formula as building the pie right now. And so that will continue through January. We expect, if things stay on track, that by mid to late January, they will develop a proposal to the steering committee. And the steering committee is comprised of the governor, commissioners, and legislators only. And so if they determine that that is the proposal, they will then write a proposal to take to the full General Assembly for the next session. That is just for the building of the pie, if you will. As Sam noted, part of that would be writing in the provision for this 12-month development on what state and local contribution could look like. And so all of that to say, if we take 12 months to do this, what would you need as a leader in your community, in your districts? What would you need to be able to have that discussion? And I say that and we pose this because when we come back together, we want to be able to come equipped with the information that would be beneficial to you and to your communities. And so when we break you up into groups, and again, the teams you brought, but if you have one or two and you want to circle up with another, feel free to do that. You can spread out, whatever. I want to try to target your discussion in 3 areas. If you had to name the top 3 things that you have to know, no matter what else we get, these are the 3 the pieces of information we will absolutely need. What are those 3 things that would then equip you to have this discussion? Because you will be leading these discussions in your meetings, and so making sure that you have what you need to do that. So that's the first thing we would ask. The second thing would be, what data would be beneficial to have? We've heard from our other sessions, perhaps it's a side-by-side, a BP and a proposed model. Perhaps it's something that's talking about our formula compared to other southern states. We heard that one, I think, yesterday. Perhaps it's also like the history of what these splits between the state and local has looked like across our state. Perhaps you all would want to pull some of your local data, but want to make sure that when we come back for what I would consider the next layer would be more of a work session, we want to make sure we have prepared and have time to prepare the information that you all would need. And then the third one there is, are there topics that you're like, we really can't even have that conversation if we don't have more information on X? I put Tasser and Sieber up there because those are the topics we've heard quite a bit, to say, what's underneath each of those models? What are they capturing? What does Tasser focus on? What does Sieber focus on? And how are those calculations kind of rolling together? Are those still the right models? Are there other models we should consider? Are we looking at other opportunities there? So I picked that as the example, but are there areas or topics that you feel like we need a 101 on this? We need a deeper dive into this topic to be able to have a meaningful discussion about what the state and local contributions could and should be. As we think about right now, Sam mentioned the 4 pots, and we're all very accustomed and comfortable with those. Are those still the right pots? We've heard so much about the non-academic needs of students. And where is that, like, is that appropriately represented? Is that an area that we should consider as a different topic? Those are the things that we will be discussing as we think through what that could look like and how we structure that. So what we're going to do is, again, in your groups, if you're a party of 1 or 2 and want to circle up with another, please do. Tackling these 3 things, we're going to take probably 20-ish minutes to have this discussion, and then we're going to share out, because I will say in other sessions, some of the feedback from one group has prompted additional feedback from a different group, and so we're hearing that that's really helpful to kind of prompt your thinking as well. And so you will be sharing out with the group the high level feedback that you had on these 3 things. Certainly, if you have other feedback on what should be in the formula, we want to hear that as well. But truly, for us to do this well, and for us to take the time to be thoughtful and to have what we need to have a longer, deeper discussion, I need to know what you need at your fingertips to do that. The other thing I would flag is, if there are considerations that should be like elevated, I'm saying this because we never get to discussion question 2. These conversations get pretty robust. But I would say this, if there are considerations that need to be elevated, what could those be? We've heard cost of living being one of those. being built into the formula. I would ask that you think about those. If they come up in your discussion, please be sure to flag those as well. Any questions before we break and spend the time working in your teams and then preparing to share out? All right, I will give you like a 5-minute to wrap when we get close, but with that, we'll turn it over to you and your groups. All right, here we go. We're gonna go ahead and begin to share out. I was able to get in a few of the conversations. All right, so appreciate the conversation. I've been taking notes just in the conversations I've been in. I see Sam has as well, and I will continue to do that, and Trudy's gonna help me with the note taking as well. But so many good points raised, and really what we want to hear are the things that are front of mind for you from, here are the things I have to have. Here's the information, here are the data, here are the spreadsheets, here are the numbers we would need to inform a deeper conversation. And here are some things that we need more training on. And I heard several things there. So with that, we are going to start with Trousdale County. Yes, that's what you get for sitting in the front, Clint.
I think some of the things that we said that we.
Turn around so we can all hear you.
Oh, Lord.
Stand up, Coach.
Good morning. Oh, I did not know I was gonna put on the spot. I think y'all can help me with this because I knew I was gonna be called on over the better job.
Should have haunted you.
I think one of the things that we were talking about, that we were talking to Sam that we needed was the fiscal capacity formula. I mean, is it gonna be TASER or CBER? Is it gonna be, say, 50-50? They're gonna try to swing it another way. They're gonna try to do another fiscal capacity formula. But I think we really need to know what the intentions are of how that can be calculated, and then what are those components or those metrics that's gonna be in there. We really, really need to know that going forward. The next thing that we asked for was a statewide comparison of fiscal capacity of counties and so, you know, what's your capacity compared to what you're actually paying, and trying to look at any discrepancies and being sure that all team members, all 95 counties, are putting in their fair share, which would help the state. Okay? Was anything else that we?
I think that's the two.
That's it.
Is that right?
Thank you. Thank you very much. Did you have any other comments to add, or we were all discussing together, all the results together? How about you?
I'm gonna focus on the top three things we said we needed to know. The one question was, are the anticipated changes to state funding, what will be the changes to state funding once the local funding requirement is increased? So we talked about a 3 to 5 year window where local funding will not be increased.
Right.
And so the state is hopefully going to increase funding. And then when the local funding is increased, obviously programs will have been funded. What are those new local dollars going to be used for? Or does that mean that the state funding is reducing at that point?
I'll go to that. You want me to clarify?
Yeah, sure.
So So, make sure this is, state funding is X on the new formula.
Right.
Local funding is here, held harmless.
Right.
And we're working, it's working, it's working. The 3 to 5 year is gonna expire.
Right.
Is there gonna be a change in this? If we've been working at level here, or is this going to go up? And what would those dollars be used for? Is there a change that will happen in the 3 to 5 years? Is there thinking about that?
So let me try to tackle that. So when we get the number and we get the commitment from the number in the new model, what we're calling it is kind of like a hold constant. So for 5 years, so we take a year to develop this, and then we have a 4-year kind of runway. And in that 4 years, local funding stays here, even though now state dollars beginning in the 23, if all the stars align, we get a proposal, it gets to the General Assembly and it gets passed, it would be for the 23-24 school year. So the money goes up on the state side, you all are held constant for a period of 5 years. After that 5-year period, the state will stay here, and depending on where you are above the required minimum, it may be that you stay here. It may be, though, that you choose to add more. It also may mean that even in that difference, so long as you're above the required minimum, you may not need to make a local adjustment, but you certainly could. We're trying not to create any kind of incentive to do less at the local level, clearly, but want to make sure that the state would stay here, and after that period of 5 years, making sure you're still at that required minimum. But then maintenance of effort kicks in, so long as you keep maintaining that effort, it could be that you stay that way and we move on after that 5 years. The biggest kind of caveat there would be any district that's really close, as Sam was saying, really close to that required minimum. After that period of 5 years, those would be the situations where we would have more concern about a need to increase taxes, perhaps, to cover that new required match that would be in the formula. Does that make sense? Okay.
You can I just, on that, I mean, my thinking was, after that 5 years, though, there are gonna be a lot more districts that are funded, and that required local is gonna be a lot closer than it is now. Like right now, we're way above the required local, but in 5 years, we're probably gonna be real close to that, and all those negative things that come along with your local funding body being right there at what's required, future years after that is where I'm a little concerned about that, and I think that would need to be addressed somewhere down the line.
And I think we had a great conversation about that, is looking at what could that projection look like if you are 5 million above the minimum, or 7 million, or other numbers there. But looking at it on a district by district, that's some of the analysis that we would want to tackle when we're talking about fiscal capacity as well. So I think all of these complexities are exactly why this warrants kind of a larger conversation and a longer kind of moment to look at data, to look at the impact, not just to one district, but as Clint said, across the whole state, and looking at how that could play out. What other feedback do you have for me?
Obviously, there's no secret that state sales tax has surpassed budgeted revenue with surplus. Will there be a change in the percentage contribution to school funding from the sales tax revenue that has not been changed in multiple years? And thirdly, will the new formula fund areas that are not currently fully funded?
Well, I said that.
Will the new formula fund areas that are not currently fully funded?
So when you say fully funded, talk to me a little bit more about that.
Well, we gotta be gone by 10, but, fully funded to the state means one thing. Fully funded, somebody sitting in the local seat means something totally different. Fully funded to the BEP is what you're talking about when you're talking about from the state perspective. Fully funded to me is the difference between 70% plus the 30%. And then also secondarily, the gap between Pelham City Schools is funded 1.93 special ed EAs.
Yep.
We employ 30. That's what we consider to be fully funded, to meet the needs of our students with
Sure.
student to employee discretion.
And what I would say to that is, once we see what's in the base, there are likely things you all are funding right now, and I'll pull nurses out as one of those examples, that if that becomes part of the base, then that certainly would free up money that you're currently spending on nurse salaries to do other things. And so I do know that, and as Sam shared, like, this has always been a shared model. It's just kind of figuring out what that share looks like between the state and local. So I don't know that there's a world where the state will ever fund at 100%. It's not going to happen. But thinking about how we navigate and think about fiscal capacity, revisit something that has been in place for 30 years. And I say this every step, like, there is a reason it hasn't been tackled in 30 years. It is complex on every level. And so making sure we're doing our due diligence to do it well and to have the right people informing that work, which is why we're happy to have your feedback today, and continue to encourage you. If you've not submitted that specific feedback, certainly we're all taking notes and we'll capture that, but I would also encourage you to submit it from your district. That resonates with these committee members. That resonates with legislators a whole lot more than us turning in our kind of summary of reflections here. So at the end, I'll give you that address, but appreciate that. Anything else on that? Thank you all.
Can I
Yes, sir.
speak to that?
Absolutely.
Because I see that in the same way, the funding meets, a certain multiplier. That multiplier in there, Giles County, 8 schools in one district, but one nurse,
right,
1.2 nurses or whatnot, and we need one at each school.
Okay.
And then it can go as far as the non-educational when you talk SRO officers or
right,
whatnot. So just getting the funding to match better, if it's one nurse per 3,000 kids, that makes 0 sense when our schools are not 3,000 capacity student schools. So simply changing one nurse per 3,000 to one nurse per 400 might get us nurses funded, and then we're not pulling from ourselves or Tullahoma adding 29 more employees to fund that lack to meet their need. And I just don't think that, whatever you want to call it, that multiplier, that quotient, that whatever is being in there. And then if you're only funding the district and not taking into account the number of schools, then you've taken logistics completely out of it, which truly changes, your hiring needs.
I think you raised a couple of really important points there. Number one, like that conversation about nurses, the conversation about social workers and psychologists and counselors and all those things that we're hearing about in every session, knowing that that is in the base. I mean, to your point, if you have one nurse for 3,000 kids, they're not all in the same good. And even on top of that, that's not, potentially appropriate or sufficient to meet the needs of a school or even 3,000 kids, right? So if that becomes part of the base, and if that is what is needed, one at every school, that is what I would continue to provide feedback on, to say that I know we are hearing that across every group we've been in front of. So I know that that is a loud and clear comment, but and in my mind, if that happens, then you all in the local space can say, good news, we've freed up this local dollar that we used to have to spend on nurses, and we can put it in a deferred maintenance fund. We can put it in another need that's not in the formula. And I think you hit the nail on the head, because you have to know what's in it to know what else is needed in that space.
It also can allow us to pay our teachers competitive, so we can keep them. Someone like Trousdale County, someone like us, we're surrounded by counties that are paying, much more. That also, helps us relook at our maintenance of effort and helps our commission make better decisions. But
that's a great point.
They don't know that every time that we have an opening that we're having to dip back in there, because 21 commissioners, it's a lot of information to pass along and to get through.
Great feedback. And to your point, if you free up other money, you may say, wow, we have to put that to get teachers, or wow, we really, even though we have this many social workers, now we need X to go to support. Maybe we need one additional position rather than having to fund 7 or 8 additional positions. It really does just, I think, presents an opportunity for you all to have that flexibility. As Sam said, it's a funding plan, not a spending plan. That's up to you all to make those local decisions and not be kind of restricted in how you do that. Appreciate that very much. Yes, sir.
We're better as in next anyway. They're gonna speak because I'm the mayor, so they don't like the way I think about things. But I was on the school board at one time and I stayed at Holiday Inn Express, so I can help you. Whenever early on you had talked about how the BEP formula is fully funded and that we should be careful about how we talk about that with our elected officials about our side. This guy's point is right in line with that too. When I would argue that it's not fully funded, despite the other piece saying, but here's what I'd say about that. Is there any school system in the state of Tennessee that is strictly operating off of your BEP formula? It says 1.5 nurses. You got a school system out there that's just got the 1.5 nurse that goes with that. That's not fully funded. Now, if Bedford thought we ought to have 25 nurses, that'd be one thing. If the system said you needed 20. But that formula currently as it is, in my opinion, is not putting, obviously, it's not putting a practical number. And I would argue that at the end of the day, I pray to God, the reason that we're monkeying with this is that we're not just changing it to make it different, we're changing to make it better.
Without doubt.
And that formula, no matter what it costs me, the county at the end, or the state, if 9 ESL teachers is what Bedford at a minimum needs to have, that formula should say 9, not 2. Okay, guys? And then even if I got to pay for it. So that's when you hear us and when we're talking to legislators about it's not fully funded. That's what we're saying when we say that. Not that Bedford chose to have 15 more of them. We're saying your formula didn't even put a practical number in there. And I would argue at the end of the day, this whole concept, when it's said and done, should be that every school system in the state of Tennessee could operate with this new formula if you didn't do anything else. Now, Bedford chooses to have 14 other programs that does all these other things, that's fine. But this formula is smoke and mirrors about what's really going on.
Well, I do think you
that.
highlight exactly why we are here today and why we are tackling this important issue. Because to your point, it is not meeting the needs where we are currently.
But even money-wise, when you said, well, you're going to free up money that you're paying on something else now that could go somewhere else, I'm not sure that's going to happen because if in fact you change the formula to say it should be 9 teachers and not 1.5 or nurses, as you currently say, are we expecting the state's going to dump that kind of money into it? They're probably not. It's just going to make my part
underlying kind of contention is that the state, it will be a larger increase in state to education. That's the whole.
But the current money being spent on our side of the world, I'd be stunned and I'd be happy to take you to dinner if I'm wrong. At the end of the day, it will have to be infused back into this new formula just to get back to where you're currently at, not where we're trying to go. So, I mean, or would you dispute that and say you expect the state's going to infuse the kind of money in there that truly the dollars we're spending at the local level will be freed up and then we can go after?
I can't speak to what the General Assembly will do, but what I can say is that I know that there is a will to do this now. And there is ability to do it now, and we are really pushing because we don't want to miss that opportunity to free up more money for students. And in this new discussion, whether it's over here with the subcommittees or here with this state local contribution component, that we continue to have that conversation to get us closer to where we need to be. Appreciate very much.
So would you think 9 will be 9 in the new formula?
I can't speak to that. I'm not on a subcommittee, but certainly as soon as we get the model, and we hope to have that, like I said, some more information late January. We certainly will and should continue that conversation.
No,
sure.
I was just going to say what he said, and I guess what he said now, because in the past, we've noticed for years, they treat us like we're one giant school, you earned this, and we're not one giant school. I mean, if we could combine all of these, that formula might work a little better, but it needs to be looked at, I think, on a more individual school level, and the numbers, like you earned this many nurses for this size school.
Yes, I think that's a really valid point to the comment over here about having 3,000 kids across 8 schools or whatever, knowing that the individual building needs could certainly differ. I think that's a valid, and I will make sure I include that. I've heard that several times this week, so I think that's a great point. Other feedback? Yes, sir.
Right here. I just want to make a comment that of the 140 plus school districts in the state, only Union County and Gibson Special School District are below Bedford in per pupil spending. Period. If we were funded on a per pupil basis based on our ability to pay or what CASA puts forth. If we were to fund education in Bedford, like we're about $4,651,000 short of our ability to pay. So that's where our shortfall comes in on the per pupil spending. And what that's doing, then distributing that money amongst all the schools in Bedford County. We have about, let me back up, we'll make one note here. A lot of people always thank Mississippi for being at the bottom of things, because we can be better than Mississippi. And, but with that said, Utah has the lowest per pupil spending in the nation of about $7,800. And Bedford, we have 45% of our students at $7,800 or below. So in Bedford, we have the least amount of spending in the nation with 45% of our students. So with all of that said, I know that there are local issues as it relates to being able to raise taxes or being able to put forth the money to fund education. But if the state were to establish a minimum, that there's got to be a minimum per pupil expenditure in the state of Tennessee. Period. I think that would solve a lot of problems. Because the reason I said that, I was working with the mayor not too long ago.
That's what I want you to.
And while I was there, we had to put in a new jail. The state made Bedford County put in a new jail. Then the state came back and says, we had these jail consultants come in. And they analyzed everything. They said, well, you people did not put in enough money for jailers. You have got to have for X number of inmates, you have a jailer. So they set a minimum for the number of jailers. Basically the expenditure that you're going to have for prisoners, for jails. So at least we ought to have a minimum for schools.
I think that's a valid point. I appreciate you sharing that. And I definitely think that part of what they're trying to do with that base is establish something like that. So I think that's a very well-founded piece of feedback there, knowing that we have those criteria for other things.
And we in Bedford County, I think our ratio is like 16.1, the average for the South Central School District, 14.8 ratio of students to teachers. And so with that said, we're about 38 teachers short, and we're having to use money that should be going to ESL to fund these other teachers. So it's just a bad format.
Well, we are here to get feedback and to share this again with the subcommittees, but also as we think about the follow-up conversations for this component. I really appreciate your comments. This side of the room, I know we've been.
I got one more.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
On this DASSER or whatever that
Sure.
other
Seaber.
CBER, I think we need transparent information on what that is.
Yep.
Because I've actually tried to compute the BEP formula and I can't because I don't know what the numbers are they're plugging in. And I think it'd be nice to have that explained to everybody so anybody can come up and recreate that formula. 'Cause
That
we don't
level of
have that, we don't
transparency,
have
yeah.
that ability now.
Agreed. And I think that's one of those areas that probably would help everyone understand what are those factors underneath each of those. And it would also help us inform, are those the right models? Is it still 50-50? I think those
Well,
are
it
the
makes
things.
it look like somebody's manipulating those numbers to get what they want. No matter what this
Right.
formula comes up besides that.
I think that's great, and I've heard that a lot as that kind of piece of information that would be helpful to have. Appreciate that feedback very much.
Just a comment, maybe a goal, I'm not sure what this is, but, right now, I think we can legitimately say that the BEP formula does not meet the educational needs across the state of Tennessee. Because everybody has many positions, we got 40-some positions above it. So I think a goal for this whole process is 10 years after this formula is in place, whatever it's called, that shouldn't be a statement to be made. Whatever this formula is, needs to meet the needs of all the educational needs across the state of Tennessee.
Thank you for that I think that's what we all hope, is that we are developing a formula that is getting us close to that, getting us there, so that we can say that, we look at how much we spend as a state on education. We have a governor and a general assembly that is committed to funding education more, and we want to make sure we get this right for now and 10 years from now as well. Other feedback from the group here?
First of all, thanks Sam for coming. Thanks Steve for coming. Appreciate y'all being here and doing this with us. I agree with everything that's been said. I'm gonna put a little bit of a twist on it.
Okay.
So the way I understand it is there's an appetite for a new formula with the general assembly. We have money now available, right? Okay. I worry about today. I worry about this budget cycle. How are we going to be funded this year? I really need to make some changes now. And I realize that if we change this, go to a new formula, that it can't be implemented until 2023, right?
Right.
I need to do some things now. So if the money's there for 2023, surely it's there today for this budget cycle. So unless the General Assembly votes to hold us harmless, because we're funded right now based off of 18-19. My numbers are going backwards because I got so many kids going to homeschool. We really showed them what was possible during COVID, and some of our people like that. They've gone homeschool, we're losing people. So it's really hard. I need to make some raises. I need to do some things. I can't do it when my enrollment's going backwards. I'm actually losing money. So I was kind of under the impression at one time that we would be held harmless again or funded this budget cycle based off of what we just went through. But I'm about to hit a cliff. And so if the money's there for 2023, surely it's there now. I know you can't, I know you aren't in charge of that, but it would be great if we could have some kind of stopgap money. If that money's there, please find a way to give it to us now. I know the appetite's not there to infuse that into the BEP, but just any new funds that we could get and get them right now, I think would be great for us, because we are all in a employee crisis and we're fighting for employees, and I need to raise some salaries. I need to do some things. So I'm going backwards.
I appreciate those comments. I know I don't have that information today, but I will have my word that I understand, and I both will share your comments and take all of that into account. So I appreciate it. Other feedback that hasn't been shared? Anything else? How are we doing on time? 5 minutes. 5 minutes. Okay. So let's do this really quickly. And I will just say this. The other considerations, these are some of the things we heard in previous groups about inflation, cost of living, and even though the current BEP has an inflation metric, maybe it's not enough. Like, are there things that we should consider about cost of living increases as well that are currently not? Thinking about now, but also thinking about 5 years down the road, what is happening in your region, in your area, that you may need to begin to think about in this planning. I've mentioned a couple of times the additional work that is needed here and what that structure will look like. Having you all here today has been incredibly helpful. It also makes me think about, okay, making sure we have the right folks involved, and if there are roles, and I won't say people because it may be that person just couldn't come today, but if there are roles that are needed that aren't included here, please let us know that as we think about how best to structure the work going forward. The other thing I had was participants, because superintendents turnover, elected officials turnover, board members turnover. So thinking about how we create over the next 12 months a group that can continue to do the hard work. The one thing I should have put on this slide is, what does that feedback look like? Because what we don't want is anything that feels like it's being developed in a vacuum and no one else knows what's going on. So how do we continue, if we have a group working on this over the next 12 months, how do we continue to get information back out to you so that you can then feed it back into those discussions? And of course, coming up with what we end up with at the end. I mentioned this a little bit earlier, but clearly after today, this is just the tip of this conversation. And so as you go back and you all continue to talk amongst yourselves and your colleagues that maybe weren't able to be here today, if you have other feedback, please try to get that from them and share that back with us. We are going to send, and I'm going to put the QR code back up because I do think a couple of folks came in and weren't able to do it. We're going to use that to send you the PowerPoint, but also give you an opportunity to share any other feedback that you decided not to share in the group today. We want that as well. And finally, I would say, and I mentioned it a moment ago, it is more impactful to hear your context, your situation, versus I'll do my very best to capture the conversations, as I know Trudy and Sam and I will do across, we have one more. But I think having situations that can explain unique situations and contexts that should be considered is best coming from you. So this is the place that it comes. It is received, it is reviewed on every day, and it is passed to the subcommittees as it's received to inform their work. And if you know folks on the subcommittees, you should reach out. All of that information, all of the meetings are on the website. So, you know, I encourage you to stay engaged as we continue to do this work. On behalf of Sam, Trudy, and myself, I would just say thank you again for sticking in here for 2 hours, for pushing in places that need to be pushed, for flagging things that should be considered. Certainly, I don't have all of the answers, Sam doesn't, none of us do yet, but what I am confident about is being informed by you and your work at your local levels will help us get where we need to be in this discussion. So with that, I say safe travels if it's still raining, and I hope you all have a Merry Christmas. Oh, yes, thank you.
Yes, Sam, thank you so much. Yes, done
I was not able to get on.
There you go, type that. Let me see. You mind? Okay. All right, let's see. All right.
Maybe because I'm not on the network. It shows that I'm on the network.
Let me do this.